Story 1 by Daniel Harper. It was the summer of 2001, a time that seared into my memory for all the wrong reasons. We had just moved to a small, run-down town in Pennsylvania, a place that seemed like it was stuck in time. My dad had taken a job at a factory nearby, and my mom had been excited about the slower pace of life. But I hated it. The town felt suffocating, like something wasn't right from the moment we arrived. I was 10 at the time, and with no friends and no real place to go, I spent most days riding my bike through the quiet streets. It wasn't long before I stumbled across the old school on the edge of town. Abandoned, crumbling, and surrounded by an overgrown fence, the place seemed out of place, like something out of a forgotten past. I had heard some of the local kids talk about it, how it had been shut down after a fire back in the 80s, how a part of it was still charred. No one went near it. It was just one of those places that people didn't talk about, let alone visit. But I was 10, and curiosity was hard to resist. I had to check it out. I remember the day vividly. It was a hot, sticky afternoon, and the sun was barely poking through thick clouds that seemed to hang unnaturally low. I propped my bike against the rusted chain-link fence and found a small gap in the back where the fence had been cut. Crawling through, I walked across the overgrown yard toward the school. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. It wasn't fear exactly, but something about the silence around the place made me uneasy. I could hear nothing but my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. There were no birds, no bugs, just this unnatural stillness. I reached the front door, which was hanging off its hinges, and gave it a push. The door creaked loudly, and as I stepped inside, I was hit by the overwhelming smell of damp wood and mold. The hallway in front of me was dark, with faded linoleum floors and lockers lining the walls. I wasn't sure why, but I could feel my heart racing. I walked down the hall slowly, peeking into classrooms. Most of them were empty, with desks overturned and broken chairs scattered around. But there was one classroom at the end of the hall that had the door closed. Something about that door felt wrong. It was the only one that was shut, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was behind it. I don't know why I opened it. Maybe it was just a mix of boredom and that strange pull you get when you're doing something you shouldn't. The door was heavy, but it opened with a groan, and inside was something I didn't expect. The room was mostly empty except for one corner where there was a pile of old sleeping bags, some empty cans, and wrappers. It looked like someone had been living there recently. I felt a chill go down my spine. Homeless people? Kids sneaking in? Whoever it was, they weren't there now, but the idea that someone had been using this place, this disgusting, abandoned school, gave me an unsettling feeling. I was about to leave when I noticed something on the wall. Written in what looked like chalk, there was a name, Kara. The letters were big but messy, like someone had scribbled it in a hurry. Underneath it, there was something else. I squinted, trying to make out the faint letters, but then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. I froze. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My heart was pounding in my chest as I strained to listen, trying to figure out if it was just my imagination. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were real. I bolted. I didn't wait to see who or what was coming down that hallway. I ran out of the classroom, down the corridor, and through the front door, my legs barely keeping up with my fear. I didn't stop until I reached my bike and pedaled away as fast as I could. My mind raced, replaying the sound of those footsteps over and over. When I got home, I didn't say anything to my parents. I didn't want them to know I had been snooping around the old school. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. Maybe they had seen me. Maybe they were still living in that place. The next few days were quiet. I avoided the school, but I couldn't avoid the dreams. Every night I'd dream of walking down that same hallway, hearing those same footsteps. They always started faint, like they were far away, but by the end of the dream, they'd be right behind me. I'd wake up, my heart racing, convinced that someone had followed me home. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I found out the truth. My parents were at the diner talking to some of the locals, and I overheard a conversation. One of the men was talking about a girl, Kara. She had gone missing years ago, back when the school was still open. They said she had been last seen near the school, but no one had ever found her. That was when it clicked. The name on the wall, the pile of sleeping bags, it all started to make sense. I wasn't the first one to wander into that place. Whoever had been there before me, whoever had written her name on the wall, had left something behind. But what scared me the most wasn't the fact that I had been in the same place as someone who had disappeared. It was the footsteps. Those slow, deliberate footsteps that I had heard in the hallway. I never went back to that school. A few years later, they tore it down and the lot was cleared for new construction. But I've always wondered, who was following me that day? Was it Kara, or was it someone else? Someone who had been watching, waiting for me to come closer. Story 2 by Mark Connolly. When you're 12 years old, the world still feels big and unexplored. That summer of 1998 was no different. My friend Ethan and I spent most of our time riding bikes, throwing rocks into the creek and seeing how far we could push each other with dares. You know, the usual stuff. Usual. But there was one dare that changed everything for us. We lived in a small town on the outskirts of Chicago. The kind of town where people leave their doors unlocked and everyone knows each other. But on the far edge of town, there was an old house that nobody talked about. We called it the old man's house, though I'm not sure any of us knew why. The place had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, and rumors flew around about why. Some said the owner had died, leaving the place to rot. Others said he had gone crazy and vanished into the woods. Whatever the reason, the house stood alone, decaying and forgotten. Ethan and I had biked past it dozens of times, but one humid August afternoon, Ethan threw out a challenge I couldn't ignore. I bet you won't go inside. I glanced at the house, its windows covered in grime, the porch sagging. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Why would I want to? I said, trying to play it cool. Ethan smirked. Because you're not a chicken, right? Let's see who's braver. Being 12, there was no way I was backing down from that. Fine, I muttered. We'll both go. We waited until evening, when the streets were quiet. Ethan grabbed a flashlight from his dad's garage, and we made our way to the old house. By the time we reached the overgrown yard, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the lawn. The air felt thick with humidity, and the cicadas were buzzing loudly. The house seemed even more intimidating in the dark. The gate creaked as Ethan pushed it open. "Still want to do this?" he asked, looking at me sideways. "Let's just get it over with," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The front door was unlocked, which shouldn't have been surprising given how long the place had been abandoned, but it still made my stomach twist. Ethan gave me a look, and we stepped inside. The smell of mildew hit me instantly, mixed with the scent of old wood and dust. It wasn't a large house, just a living room, kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. The floors creaked under our feet, and I could see cobwebs hanging in the corners. There were still some pieces of furniture, an old couch, a coffee table, and a dusty TV set that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. We walked through the house in silence, our footsteps echoing off the empty walls. It was eerie, but nothing out of the ordinary. Until we got to the back bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and something about it made my skin crawl. Ethan pushed it open and we both stepped inside. The room was mostly empty, except for a mattress on the floor and some old newspapers scattered around. But there was something else, something that made my heart pound in my chest. On the floor near the window, there were a few cans of food, a sleeping bag, and a half-empty bottle of water. "Someone's been here," I whispered, my throat dry. Ethan nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, recently." We stood there for a moment, frozen. My mind was racing. Who had been staying here? And were they still around? That's when we heard it. A shuffle, faint, but coming from outside the room, down the hallway. I turned to Ethan, my eyes wide. "We need to leave, now." He nodded, and we backed out of the room slowly, our footsteps as quiet as we could make them. But as we reached the living room, I heard another sound, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard behind us. My heart was pounding in my ears. Someone was definitely in the house with us. I grabbed Ethan's arm, and we bolted for the front door. I didn't even care about being quiet anymore. We threw the door open and ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we were halfway back to my house. We didn't talk much on the way home. We were too shaken up. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, Ethan turned to me, his face pale. That wasn't just an empty house. I nodded. Someone's living there. We never told anyone what happened that night, mostly because we didn't want to get in trouble for trespassing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been in that house had been watching us the whole time. Maybe they were just a drifter, someone passing through. But maybe they had been waiting for us to leave, waiting to make sure we didn't see too much. We never went back to the old man's house, and to this day I wonder who was there with us that night. A homeless person, a squatter, or maybe something darker. But one thing's for sure. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in that empty, decaying house. Story 3 by Jack Monroe. When I was 14, I learned that fear isn't just something in your head. It's something that can reach out and grab you when you least expect it. I'm not talking about ghosts or monsters. I'm talking about the real kind of fear. The kind that makes your heart pound and your breath catch in your throat, knowing that something is truly wrong. That's what happened to me one night in October, and I still can't shake the memory. It was a chilly Saturday evening, the kind where the wind bites at your skin and the trees rustle in ways that make you uneasy. My friends and I were bored, as usual. In our small town, there wasn't much to do once the sun went down except sit around and come up with dumb ideas. This time, the dumb idea came from Mike. "There's an old cabin out by the lake," he said, leaning in like he had some big secret. "It's been abandoned for years. No one goes there anymore." "Yeah?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "So what?" "So," Mike grinned. "I say we check it out. See what's inside?" The others laughed nervously, but I could see the excitement in their eyes. We'd heard about the cabin before. Everyone had. The story went that some old guy had lived there alone until one day he just disappeared. No one knew where he went, and after a while, people stopped caring. But the cabin stayed, rotting away in the woods by the lake, and over time, it became one of those places kids dared each other to visit but never did. "Come on," Mike said, seeing our hesitation. "It'll be fun. We'll be back before dark." I wasn't sure about it. I mean, I didn't believe in the rumors, but there was something about that place that felt off. Still, I wasn't about to be the only one chickening out, so like an idiot, I went along with it. We grabbed our bikes and rode out to the edge of town, where the woods grew thick and dark around the lake. We followed a narrow trail, just wide enough for our bikes, until we saw it, the cabin. It sat there, hunched under the trees, half hidden by overgrown bushes and weeds. The wood was weathered and gray, and one of the windows had been broken, leaving jagged glass like teeth. It looked worse than I imagined. Mike was the first to hop off his bike. "Told you it's real," he said with a grin, heading for the front door. I stayed back for a second, staring at the place. It wasn't just creepy, it was sad. Like something bad had happened there, something no one talked about. But I shook the feeling off and followed the others. The door creaked open, the sound echoing through the quiet woods. Inside, the cabin was a wreck. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled musty, like wet wood and decay. A single, torn-up armchair sat in the corner facing a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. There were shelves on the walls, but they were empty, and the floorboards creaked under our feet. "This place is a dump," Mike said, kicking at a pile of leaves that had blown in through the broken window. We split up, poking around the small cabin. I checked one of the back rooms, which was even worse. The roof had caved in a little, letting rainwater pool in the corner, and there were weird marks on the walls, scratches like someone had tried to claw their way out. I felt a chill run down my spine. I was about to leave when I noticed something on the floor. An old metal box, half hidden under a pile of debris. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, and rusty, like it had been there for years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I knelt down to open it. Inside were photographs, black and white pictures of people, families mostly. But they weren't happy pictures. The people looked scared. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, like they'd been caught in the middle of something terrible. One of the pictures showed a man standing in front of the cabin. He was staring straight at the camera, his expression blank, but something about his eyes made my stomach twist. "Guys," I called out, holding up the box, "you need to see this." Mike and the others came over, and as soon as they saw the pictures, the mood shifted. What had started as a fun dare suddenly felt dangerous. These weren't just old family photos, these were warnings. "We should go," I said, standing up. My voice sounded shaky, even to me. But Mike shook his head. "It's just old junk. Someone probably left it here years ago." "Yeah, but look at their faces, man," one of the others said, flipping through the pictures. "They're terrified." Mike opened his mouth to say something, but then we heard it, a sound from outside. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming closer. We all froze, eyes wide. No one had seen another car or bike on the trail. No one should have been out here. We were miles from the nearest house. Mike motioned for us to be quiet. He edged toward the window and peeked out. His face went pale, and for the first time that night, I saw fear in his eyes. "Someone's out there," he whispered. We backed away from the window, hearts pounding. The footsteps were louder now, circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I don't know how long we stood there, holding our breath, waiting for whatever was outside to show itself. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The silence was worse. We stood there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. And then we heard it, a knock on the door. 3 sharp, loud knocks that echoed through the tiny cabin. None of us moved. Who is it?" Mike stammered, his voice barely audible. No answer, just silence. The knocks came again, harder this time, shaking the door in its frame. I felt a surge of panic, my heart racing. This wasn't some prank. Someone knew we were here and they weren't friendly. "We need to leave. Now," I whispered, my voice barely holding together. Mike nodded, and we slowly backed away from the door. As quietly as we could, we slipped out the back one by one and sprinted to our bikes. We didn't stop pedaling until we were halfway back to town. We never went back to that cabin. We never talked about what happened either. But every time I ride past the lake, I think about that night. The photographs, the footsteps, the knocks on the door, and I wonder who or what was watching us, and why they haven't come looking for us yet.